Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads. Glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It began in the tender space between day and night, when stories change their guard and the world holds its breath. In a cottage where books lined every wall like sleeping friends, River came into being not with fanfare, but with the soft sound of a page turning. The house itself seemed to exhale as the baby arrived, and the midwife, a gentlewoman named Clara, noticed something she had never seen in 40 years of births. The worn wallpaper in the birthing room smoothed itself, tiny tears mending, as if invisible hands were pressing them back together with infinite care. River's first cry carried the whisper of stories waiting to unfold. It wasn't the sharp demand of most newborns, but something softer, more musical, as if they were already listening to voices the rest of the world couldn't hear. When the crying stopped, and River's tiny fist closed around their mother's finger, the entire cottage settled into an unusual peace. Books on their shelves seemed to sigh with contentment, and even the old floorboards stopped their familiar creaking. The cottage had been collecting stories for 3 generations. River's grandmother, Maren, had inherited it from her own mother, who believed that tales were living things needing proper homes. Every book had been chosen not for fame, but for the particular shade of emotion it carried. Some held the warmth of summer afternoons, others the bittersweet ache of growing up, and a few contained the deep, quiet strength that comes after surviving something difficult. In those first weeks, as River learned the rhythm of breathing and sleeping and being held, they discovered something extraordinary. When Grandmother Maren read aloud from her evening poetry, River would make small sounds that seemed to match not the words, but the feelings the poems carried. A sonnet about lost love brought gentle fussing, while verses celebrating spring earned peaceful sighs. At first, the family thought this was simply a sensitive baby, responding to the music of human speech. But as weeks became months, the pattern grew impossible to ignore. When River's father read the newspaper, they would react differently to different sections, becoming restless during reports of conflict and settling into calm during stories of community celebration. When their mother sang lullabies, River seemed to taste each song differently, sometimes reaching toward her mouth as if trying to catch the melody, other times turning away from verses that carried flavors too complex for such a young palate. The revelation came when River was 6 months old. Grandmother Maren was reading a fairy tale, worn soft by generations of loving hands, when River reached out and pressed their palm against the open page. Suddenly, Maren felt a flood of sensation, as if she were tasting sunshine and wild strawberries and the particular sweetness of a happy ending earned through struggle. River looked up with eyes that seemed far older than 6 months, and she understood. Her grandchild wasn't just hearing stories, they were consuming them in ways she had never imagined possible. From that day forward, Maren began including River more intentionally in her daily ritual of tending the books. She would carry them from shelf to shelf, watching their reactions, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a story was healthy and vibrant or had grown stale from lack of attention. River would reach for certain books when they needed comfort, pressing their cheek against covers that held stories of resilience and hope. When overstimulated, they sought quieter tales that tasted of chamomile tea and afternoon naps. River's parents, practical people who loved stories but had never thought of them as living entities, gradually adapted to life with a child who experienced narratives as nourishment. They learned to be thoughtful about what they read aloud, understanding that River absorbed not just words, but the emotional residue that clung to them. Bedtime stories worked best when they chose tales loved by many people over many years, stories that carried the accumulated warmth of countless readings. As River approached their first birthday, walking early with a particular attraction to the lower bookshelves, their gift continued to evolve. They would crawl to certain books for comfort, seeking stories that held the right emotional flavor for their needs. Sometimes, when the family gathered in the evening, River would sit very still in the center of the room and seem to listen to something the adults couldn't hear, as if all the stories in the house were whispering to each other, sharing the day's experiences and settling into nighttime rest. River's older brother Marcus lived like a spark in dry straw, bright and fast and endearing, carrying trophies in his knees from climbs and daring jumps. When he held River awkwardly under the arms, they tasted clover and copper and the fizz of courage with a grin. Marcus would tell elaborate tales about his treasures, a marble, a button, a strip of clouded film, making epics from ordinary things. River listened the way seedlings listen to rain, with their whole small body. On quiet afternoons when the sky gathered like wool and the house went dim, River would haul a book twice their size into a pool of light and simply sit with it, as if warmth could pass both ways. Sometimes they read aloud in their careful new voice. Sometimes they just listened to the minute creaks of the binding, the dry whisper of turned pages, the tiny thunder that happened when a book was closed with reverence. Nothing dramatic announced itself, and that was the miracle. The strangeness wore everyday clothes and nobody argued with it. River was simply a child who tasted stories, who could sense the emotional hungers in people, who seemed to understand that books were more than ink and paper. In this gentle, breathing haven, watched over by loving family and cradled by the essence of human tales, River's extraordinary journey was just beginning. The cottage settled into sleep around them, stories whispering their good nights, and somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, River dreamed of all the tales yet to be tasted. The morning River turned 3, they woke with a question that had been growing like a seedling in the quiet spaces of their dreams. Standing barefoot in the kitchen doorway, hair wild from sleep, they looked at Grandmother Marin with eyes that held something older than their years and asked, "Why do some people taste empty?" Marin set down her teacup with the careful attention one gives to precious things. She had been waiting for this question without knowing it, the way gardeners wait for the first green shoots of spring. River had been watching people differently lately, tilting their head when neighbors visited, reaching toward strangers in the market with a concerned expression that made adults shift uncomfortably. "Show me what you mean." "Little one," Marin said, settling into the rocking chair that had belonged to her own grandmother. River climbed into her lap with the deliberate movements of a child who understood that some conversations required special closeness, the kind that made difficult truths easier to hold. River pointed to the space just above Marin's heart, where something shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "You have stories here," they said, their small finger tracing patterns in the air. "They taste like cinnamon and old paper, and the sound Mama makes when she's happy crying." Then their expression grew troubled. "But Mr. Henderson from the post office has a hole where stories should be. It tastes like when you're hungry, but forgot what food is." That afternoon, Marin took River on their first intentional story walk. They moved slowly through the village, Marin carrying a basket of muffins as an excuse for the leisurely pace, while River pointed out what they could see around different people. Mrs. Chen, hanging laundry behind her shop, glowed with what River described as soup stories and letter stories. The teenage boy who delivered newspapers carried threads that sparked like fireflies, full of adventures that hadn't happened yet. But there were others who seemed to exist in grey spaces where stories should have been. River could sense places where wonder had been worn away by routine, where imagination had been traded for practicality, where the small magics of daily life had been forgotten. These weren't bad people, River learned, just hungry ones who had forgotten they were starving. Marin began River's formal education that week. Every morning they would sit together with a different book, not to read it but to understand it. River learned to feel the difference between stories that nourished and stories that merely filled space, between tales that opened hearts and those that closed them. Some books, Marin explained, were like rich soil that helped other stories grow. Others were like candy, pleasant but lacking the nutrients needed for real sustenance. "Stories aren't just entertainment," Marin said one evening as they sorted through a box of old books. "They're how people learn to be human. They teach us what love looks like, what courage feels like, what it means to forgive or hope or grieve well. When people stop consuming healthy stories, they start to forget these things." River developed their own vocabulary for what they experienced. There was the taste of pine, which meant courage without showing off. The taste of mint meant clarity without coldness. The taste of smoke meant grief that had learned to sing. Some stories carried the dull grit of stubbornness, others the clean salt of tears that had done their healing work. The gift came with challenges. River often felt overwhelmed in crowds, surrounded by too many story flavors tangling together. They learned to find quiet corners, to press their back against walls when the narrative threads of many people created confusion. Maren taught them about boundaries, about how to tend stories without being consumed by them. "You're like a gardener," she explained. "You can care for the plants, but you don't become the plants. You can help stories grow healthy, but you don't have to carry everyone's story inside yourself." River invented small rituals for managing their gift. Each morning they would sit quietly with their favorite book of gentle fairy tales that tasted like warm milk and safety. Each evening, they helped Maren tend the books in their cottage, checking on stories that seemed lonely, ensuring every tale felt valued. One simple practice became River's favorite. When a book felt exhausted from carrying too much sorrow, they made what they called a story sandwich. A sturdy dictionary on one side, a book of lullabies on the other, with the tired tale resting between them overnight. "Bread," River would say solemnly, placing each supporting book. "And filling," they whispered, patting the weary story. In the morning, the tired book would taste like it had slept, less ash and more ember. As River's abilities grew more refined, they began to recognize when someone left the library with a book that would nourish exactly the hunger humming inside them. They could also feel when a person found no book to match their need, and the softness of that noticing made them ache with purpose. The cottage itself seemed to respond to River's growing understanding. Books would sometimes fall open to pages someone needed to read, and visitors often left feeling mysteriously comforted, as if reminded of something important they had forgotten. The house had become a place where stories lived and breathed, where the boundary between narrative and reality grew beautifully thin. On late summer evenings, when cicadas chanted their patient prayers, River would stand on the library steps and watch people drift home along the gold-tinged street. The story threads were visible now, faint but persistent, weaving and unweaving around each person like gentle auroras. River didn't yet know what shape their work would take, but they could feel it gathering like a story drawing breath before it speaks, like light preparing to pour itself into morning. In a world full of quiet hungers and half-remembered lullabies, River felt the invitation arriving without haste, to learn, to listen, to begin feeding the empty spaces they were born able to see. The empty places revealed themselves slowly, like stars appearing as twilight deepens. River, now 7 and walking with the careful attention of someone who sees more than most, began to notice that the story hungers weren't all the same. Some felt like winter soil, hard and closed but secretly preparing for spring. Others felt like doors standing slightly ajar, waiting for someone gentle enough to knock softly rather than push through. Mr. Caldwell from the bank carried emptiness that tasted of chalk and forgotten dreams. When he passed the library each morning, River could see the grey space around his shoulders where wonder used to live. Miss Eleanor, the retired schoolteacher, had story threads that had grown dusty from years of correcting papers and managing schedules. And there was young Thomas, who sat alone during recess, his small shoulders already learning to expect disappointment from the world. River's first attempt to help nearly broke their tender heart. They approached Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down and walked past their garden each morning with emptiness wrapped around her like a shawl that never warmed her. River offered their favorite book of fairy tales with the earnest confidence of childhood. "Mrs. Patterson," River said, tugging gently on her coat, "you have a hungry place. This book tastes like being tucked in. Maybe it could help." Mrs. Patterson looked down with tired eyes that had forgotten how to focus on wonder. She patted River's head absently and said, "That's sweet, dear. But I don't really have time for stories anymore." She continued walking, and River felt the rejection like a small stone in their chest. That evening, River cried against Grandmother Maren's shoulder with the particular despair of someone who had discovered that not all hungers want to be fed. "She's so empty," River sobbed. "Why doesn't she want the stories to fill the empty place?" Maren rocked slowly, her own story threads humming with deep patience. "Sometimes people get so used to being hungry that food frightens them," she said softly. "And sometimes the empty places are protecting something tender that isn't ready to trust again. Stories must be invited, little one, not insisted upon." This became River's first lesson in the delicate art of offering without attachment. Over the following weeks, Maren taught them to watch for different kinds of readiness. River learned to plant tiny story fragments instead of offering whole tales, like seeds carried on gentle wind, meant to land softly in forgotten corners of the heart. For Mr. Caldwell, River began leaving a single wildflower from their grandmother's garden on the corner of his newspaper stand before he arrived each morning. Not a story told, but a memory stirred, a brief interruption that reminded him of a time when the world was full of small, unpurchased wonders. Sometimes Maren would notice him pause, a faint smile playing on his lips as he inhaled the delicate scent. With Miss Eleanor, River would sit nearby in the village square, silently sketching in a small notebook. One afternoon, they drew a swirling, impossibly vibrant tree with branches reaching toward a sun that glittered with impossible colors. Without a word, River tore out the page and left it on the bench beside her. Later, they saw Miss Eleanor gazing at the drawing, a hint of old spark returning to her eyes, a gentle reminder of the magic she once taught her students to find in the world. The most challenging was young Thomas, who had stopped believing in happy endings. River didn't try to engage him with words. Instead, they would simply begin building small, intricate castles of pebbles and leaves nearby during recess, humming wordless tunes. Slowly, Thomas would gravitate closer, not joining but observing. One day, River left a particularly perfect pebble shaped like a tiny heart near Thomas's hand before moving away. It was a silent offering, a small piece of comfort that hinted at kindness without expectation. The breakthrough with Mrs. Patterson came unexpectedly on a rainy Thursday. She appeared in the library doorway, shaking droplets from her umbrella, and looking around with the cautious expression of someone entering unfamiliar territory. River felt their heart flutter with hope, but remembered Maren's teachings about patience. Instead of rushing over, River continued organizing books, simply allowing their presence to radiate gentle warmth. When Mrs. Patterson wandered near the poetry shelves, looking lost among the many spines, River quietly placed a small volume on a nearby table, not pushing it toward her, not speaking, just leaving it there like a flower that had bloomed in exactly the right spot. The book was a collection of poems about seasons changing, about finding beauty in ordinary moments. River had chosen it because it tasted like morning coffee and the first brave crocus pushing through snow. Mrs. Patterson picked up the book with careful movements, read a few lines, and River watched as something shifted in the gray space around her shoulders. Not dramatic transformation, but the smallest softening, like ice beginning to remember it had once been water. From that day forward, River understood that their gift wasn't about filling empty spaces quickly or completely. It was about recognizing the exact moment when someone's story hunger became ready to taste nourishment again, and then offering exactly the right flavor at exactly the right temperature. Too much too soon could overwhelm a system unused to richness. Too little might not provide enough sustenance to remind someone why stories mattered. As autumn painted the world in shades of letting go, River noticed their small acts of storytelling were creating ripples they hadn't expected. People who found nourishing tales began carrying different flavors around them, and those flavors attracted other hungry souls who recognized something they needed. The village was slowly becoming a place where stories moved more freely, where narrative nourishment was passed from hand to hand like shared bread. On evenings when the weight of so many flavors pressed in, River would step outside where the library's bricks held afternoon warmth. They would lean their forehead against the wall and listen to the building's slow heart, humming lullabies, while the bricks seemed to hum back. The world, they were learning, answered when sung to gently, and somewhere in that harmony, River felt their purpose growing like a story drawing breath before it speaks. The humming that had answered River from the library wall seemed to follow them home that evening, a gentle thread of song that lingered in the spaces between heartbeats. The next morning, drawn by something they couldn't name, River found themselves walking toward the village square earlier than usual, their bare feet finding the cool stones while dew still silvered the grass. There, beneath the old oak that had witnessed generations of market days and quiet conversations, sat a man River had never noticed before, though something about him felt familiar as breathing. His hair was the color of winter clouds, and his hands moved with the patient rhythm of someone who understood that the most important work couldn't be rushed. Spread across his lap was a tapestry that seemed to shift and breathe in the morning light, threads catching the sun like captured starlight. Samuel looked up as River approached. and his eyes held the same gentle recognition that River saw in their grandmother's face when she spoke of stories as living things. "You hear it too," he said, not as a question but as a quiet acknowledgement. His voice carried the warmth of well-worn wool and the patience of someone who had learned to listen to what couldn't be spoken aloud. River settled onto the grass beside him, drawn by the way the story threads around Samuel didn't just shimmer, but seemed to dance. Weaving patterns that spoke of connections River was only beginning to understand. "What are you making?" they asked, though they sensed the answer went deeper than thread and cloth. Samuel's weathered hands paused in their work, and he smiled with the particular gentleness reserved for questions that mattered. "The same thing you've been learning to tend, child. The places where stories touch each other, where one person's chapter becomes part of another's tale." He held up the tapestry, and River gasped softly. What had appeared to be decorative fabric revealed itself as something far more complex. Woven into the design were patterns that seemed to pulse with quiet life, threads that connected distant figures in ways that spoke of relationships River could taste but had never seen mapped so clearly. It was the village, River realized, but not as buildings and streets. It was the village as a living story, each person a thread in a larger weaving. "See here?" Samuel pointed to a section where golden thread had been carefully rewoven into a pattern that had grown thin. Mrs. Patterson's story was becoming isolated, disconnected from the warmth around her. But look now. River could see it, the way her thread had begun to weave back into the larger design, connecting to other stories of wonder rediscovered and quiet courage found. Over the following weeks, as autumn painted the world in shades of letting go and holding on, Samuel became River's teacher in the deeper mysteries of story work. He showed them how to see the invisible tapestry that held the community together, how individual narratives were never truly separate, but existed in constant, gentle relationship with countless others. "Your gift," Samuel explained as they sat together in the dappled shade, his hands guiding River's smaller ones as they learned to sense the pulse of different threads, "isn't just about tasting individual stories. It's about understanding how those stories nourish each other, how they create the larger tale that holds us all." River learned to feel the difference between threads that were healthy and strong, humming with connection and purpose, and those that had grown thin from isolation or tangled from misunderstanding. Some people's stories tried to dominate others, overwhelming them with their own narratives. Others hid their stories so completely that no connections could form. The healthiest communities, Samuel taught, were those where stories danced together, each maintaining its own integrity while contributing to something larger and more beautiful. The work required extraordinary sensitivity. River discovered that forcing connections never worked, and often caused more harm than leaving threads separate. Each story had its own timing, its own readiness for relationship. The art lay in recognizing when conditions were right for gentle weaving, and when patience was the only appropriate response. One afternoon, eager to help, River sensed a place where Mr. Caldwell's growing thread of wonder might connect with young Thomas's fragile strand of hope. Without thinking, they reached out with their gift, trying to weave the connection themselves. The moment they pushed too hard, both threads recoiled, and River felt Thomas retreat further into his shell, while Mr. Caldwell's newfound openness dimmed slightly. Samuel's hand settled gently on River's shoulder, not scolding, but steadying. "Stories must choose their own connections," he said softly. "Our role is to create conditions where natural weaving can happen, not to force threads together before they're ready." He showed River how to offer presence instead of pressure, how to hold space for stories to find each other in their own time. As the days grew shorter and the village settled into the rhythm of early darkness and longer tales shared by firelight, River began to notice changes in the community's story tapestry. Conversations happened differently, with more curiosity about others' experiences and less need to prove or persuade. People lingered longer in shared spaces, drawn by invisible threads of connection they couldn't name but could feel. The grocery store became a place where neighbors exchanged not just goods, but fragments of their stories. The post office transformed into a hub, where news was shared with genuine care rather than mere gossip. Even the library seemed to breathe differently, as if the books themselves were responding to the increased flow of nourishing narrative between the people who visited them. Samuel's teaching extended beyond technique to something deeper. "We are all part of one great story," he would say as they worked together, watching the interplay of threads in the late afternoon light. Individual narratives are like chapters in an infinite book. When we help stories connect properly, we're participating in the writing of something much larger than ourselves. River felt the truth of this settling into their bones like warmth from a well-tended fire. Each small act of story-tending contributed to a growing tapestry of community connection. Every empty space they helped nourish became a place where other stories could find sustenance. Every thread they helped strengthen added to the resilience of the entire fabric. On evenings when the work felt overwhelming, when River could taste too many hungers and feel too many frayed connections, Samuel would remind them of the tapestry's inherent wisdom. "Stories want to connect," he'd say gently, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned to trust in larger rhythms. "Your job isn't to force them together, but to create conditions where natural connections can flourish. Trust the threads to find their own way home." As winter approached, and the first frost touched the edges of the oak's remaining leaves, River felt their understanding deepening like roots finding rich soil. They were no longer just someone who could taste stories, but someone learning to tend the invisible web that held community together, one gentle thread at a time. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt their purpose growing clearer. Like a story drawing breath before it speaks its most important truth, winter arrived like a whispered secret, settling over the village in layers of silver and silence. River, now 13 and grown tall in the way of saplings reaching toward light, woke each morning to a world transformed by frost that painted stories on every window. Their gift had deepened during these months of Samuel's patient teaching, evolving from the simple tending of empty spaces into something more complex and delicate, the art of story mending. The work was different from anything River had learned before. Where story tending involved nourishing hungry places with gentle offerings, story mending required understanding how narratives could break, tangle, or lose their way entirely. Some stories, River discovered, carried tears that weren't immediately visible, but created drafts that chilled everything around them. Others had become knotted with pain or twisted by trying to carry burdens that belonged to someone else's tale. Samuel's workshop became River's second classroom, a place where the scent of aged wood and careful repairs filled the air like incense. Among the real tapestries he mended with needle and thread, Samuel taught River to work with the invisible story threads that wove between people's hearts. "You don't force a broken thread back together," he would say, his weathered hands demonstrating on cloth what River was learning to do with narratives. "You find the ends, prepare them gently, and then, with patience and respect, you help them remember how to connect." The first profound mending came through Mr. Abernathy, the widower whose story had collapsed into a single aching note of loss. His narrative threads tasted of ash and endless winter, as if spring had been forgotten entirely. River didn't try to change his grief or convince him to feel differently. Instead, they began sitting with him in his silent garden, offering presence without pressure, witnessing without trying to fix. Week after week, River would arrive and settle quietly on the old wooden bench, listening to the wind chime's gentle song and watching bees work among the herbs that still grew wild. They didn't speak much, but their presence seemed to create space for something that had been held too tightly to breathe. Slowly, River began to taste other flavors in Mr. Abernathy's story threads, buried beneath the grief but still there, the warmth of shared laughter, the contentment of quiet companionship, the particular sweetness of love that had grown deeper with time. One afternoon, without prompting, Mr. Abernathy began to speak, not of his wife's passing, but of her favorite roses, the way she hummed while gardening, a trip they had taken to the coast years before. River listened with their whole being, and in that witnessing, they felt his story beginning to remember its other chapters. The grief remained, but it was no longer the only thread in his tapestry. It became part of a larger weaving that included joy and tenderness, loss transformed into a testament to love rather than its ending. Clara presented a different kind of mending challenge. The brilliant student had begun struggling, her usual spark dimmed by anxiety that tasted like bitter disappointment and self-doubt. Her story threads weren't broken so much as tangled, wound so tightly with fear that she had forgotten her own capacity for learning and growth. River found Clara in the library one grey afternoon, staring blankly at textbooks that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Instead of offering academic help, River quietly pulled a worn copy of fairy tales from the shelf and sat nearby, not opening it but simply holding it. The book tasted of hidden gardens and unexpected discoveries, of finding beauty in neglected corners of the world. Sometimes, River said softly, not looking directly at Clara, but at the book's faded cover, the most important things are hidden, even from ourselves. They're still there, though, waiting to be remembered. They spoke of their own moments of feeling lost in a story, unable to find the thread that led to the next page, and the quiet satisfaction of unlocking. Difficult passages not with force but with patience and trust. River learned that story mending often required sitting with difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them, witnessing pain without trying to take it away. Some days, the work left them exhausted by the weight of so many tender places in the community's fabric. Samuel taught them to tend their own story threads with equal care, showing them rituals of restoration, long walks where their own narrative could settle back into healthy rhythms, quiet mornings with books that nourished their particular hungers. The mistakes were gentle teachers, too. When River tried to rush a connection that wasn't ready, they felt the recoil in both stories involved and learned the crucial difference between creating conditions for healing and forcing outcomes. Samuel's patient presence during these moments of learning reminded River that even master weavers sometimes had to unknot their work and begin again. As winter deepened and the village adapted to shorter days and longer stories shared by firelight, River noticed that their mending work created unexpected ripples. People whose narratives had been repaired seemed to carry a different quality of presence, a steadiness that others were drawn to. They became natural places where other frayed stories could find rest and gentle tending. Mrs. Chen's grocery store began to feel different when her story threads regained their natural warmth, no longer strained by trying to carry her daughter's disappointments as her own failures. Customers lingered longer, sharing news with genuine interest rather than mere politeness. The repair in her story had created space for other stories to breathe more easily. One evening, as River sat with Samuel watching the interplay of threads in the community's invisible tapestry, they asked the question that had been growing in their heart, like a seed waiting for the right season. How do you know when a story is truly healed? Samuel's weathered hands smoothed a section of the tapestry where new threads were beginning to weave themselves into healthy patterns. When it stops needing to be held so carefully, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of years spent in patient service. When it can dance with other stories without fear. When it contributes to the larger weaving without losing its own integrity. River felt this truth settling into their understanding, like snow finding its place on familiar ground. Around them, the village slept under winter's gentle blanket, stories mending themselves in dreams, threads learning to trust connection again. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt their gift deepening into something that could hold both the fragility and the resilience of the human heart, preparing them for the deeper work that lay ahead. Spring arrived with the gentle insistence of stories that refused to stay buried, carrying with it the particular energy that comes when narratives are ready to unfold in new directions. River, now 13 and grown thoughtful in the way of young trees learning to bend without breaking, felt the shift in the cottage's rhythm before they heard Marcus's familiar knock at the door. Their older brother had returned from his first year at university, and with him came story threads that sparkled with new colors River had never tasted before. Marcus burst through the doorway like sunlight breaking through clouds, all restless energy and half-finished sentences, his arms full of books and his eyes bright with the particular intensity of someone who had been living too many stories at once. At 21, he moved through their childhood home with a mixture of belonging and restlessness, as if the familiar spaces were both too small and exactly the right size for the person he was becoming. "Look at this place," Marcus said, spinning in the center of the kitchen with affection that carried undertones River couldn't quite identify. Same books breathing on their shelves, same grandmother Marin making tea like it's a sacred ritual, same River growing taller when I'm not looking. He grinned, but River tasted something beneath the brightness, a flavor like honey mixed with something more complex, more uncertain. Over the following days, River watched their brother with the careful attention they had learned to apply to community story mending. But this felt different. These weren't the simple hungers of neighbors or the gentle tangles of acquaintances. These were family threads, woven deep into River's own narrative, complex with shared history and the particular intimacy of growing up in the same story. Marcus spoke of his achievements with practiced enthusiasm, regaling them with tales of debates won and friendships forged, but his story threads carried flavors that didn't match his words. River tasted the metallic edge of trying too hard, the bitter complexity of reaching for goals that seemed to belong to someone else's vision of success. When Marcus described his future plans, his voice carried all the right notes of ambition and determination, but underneath River sensed something that tasted like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. The revelation came during the village's annual spring festival. When Marcus entered the traditional foot race with his usual confident swagger, River watched from the sidelines, feeling the familiar warmth of pride in their brother's natural athleticism. Marcus had always been the golden child of such events, moving through competitions with the easy grace of someone born to win. But this time, something went wrong. Whether it was a loose stone or a moment of inattention, Marcus stumbled just meters from the finish line, his lead evaporating as younger competitors swept past him. River felt the shock ripple through Marcus's story threads. The bright confidence suddenly shot through with threads of ash and disappointment. Marcus recovered quickly, laughing off the stumble with his characteristic charm, offering elaborate explanations about uneven ground and untied shoelaces. But River tasted the truth beneath the performance, the way his authentic disappointment was being buried under layers of deflection and forced humor. When the other competitors gathered for the traditional post-race celebration, Marcus slipped away, retreating to his childhood room with a book clutched like armor against his chest. River found him that evening, not reading but sitting at the window, staring out at the familiar landscape with the particular stillness of someone trying not to think too hard about something important. The book lay unopened beside him, and his hands moved restlessly, as if looking for something to hold that might make sense of what he was feeling. "The race doesn't matter," Marcus said without turning around, his voice carrying the forced lightness of someone trying to convince himself. "It was just for fun anyway. Who cares about running in circles?" River settled onto the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of family storywork settling around them like a cloak they weren't sure they were ready to wear. This was different from helping Mr. Abernathy with his grief or supporting Clara through her academic struggles. This was Marcus, whose story had been intertwined with their own since before memory, whose narrative threads were woven so deeply into River's understanding of family that untangling them felt like trying to separate their own heartbeat from the rhythm of their breathing. "You cared," River said softly, not as an accusation, but as a gentle acknowledgement of truth. "I could taste how much it mattered to you." Marcus's shoulders tensed, and for a moment River thought he might retreat further into his defensive humor. But something in their tone, perhaps the lack of judgment or the simple recognition of his authentic feelings, seemed to create space for a different kind of response. "Everything's supposed to matter," Marcus said finally, his voice dropping to something more honest than River had heard since his return. "At university they tell you that every grade, every connection, every opportunity is crucial for your future. Every stumble is a failure. Every success is never quite enough. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's story, following a script that makes perfect sense to everyone except me." River felt the truth of their brother's words, settling between them like a stone dropped into still water. This wasn't about a single race or even about winning and losing. This was about the deeper hunger River had been sensing. The way Marcus's authentic story threads had become tangled with external expectations and borrowed definitions of success. From Samuel's teaching, River understood that family stories were like root systems, running deeper and connecting more extensively than other narratives. When you worked with them, you weren't just mending one thread but potentially affecting an entire network of relationships and shared understanding. The work required extraordinary delicacy and a different kind of patience than community story mending. "Remember when we used to build kingdoms in the sandbox behind the cottage?" River asked, their voice carrying the particular gentleness they had learned to use when touching tender places in someone's story. "You never built them to impress anyone or prove anything. You built them because you loved the process of creating something beautiful. of seeing what was possible when you let your imagination run free. Marcus turned from the window, his attention caught by the memory. River continued, letting their words carry the flavor of those childhood afternoons, when time moved like honey and every grain of sand held infinite possibility. Your stories were always about discovery then, about finding new ways to make ordinary things magical. That hasn't changed, Marcus. It's just gotten buried under other people's definitions of what success should look like. Over the following weeks, River learned that mending family stories required not just different techniques, but a different understanding of their own role in the process. They couldn't simply offer gentle presence and wait for healing to unfold naturally, as they might with a community member. They had to navigate the complex territory of sibling love, with all its protective instincts, shared vulnerabilities, and the particular intimacy that comes from growing up in the same story. River began to understand that helping Marcus wasn't about changing his story, but about helping him remember which parts of his narrative were authentically his and which had been added by external voices. They spent long afternoons together, not talking directly about his struggles, but simply sharing space in the ways that had always nourished their connection. They worked in Grandmother Marin's garden, Marcus's hands remembering the rhythm of tending growing things. They walked the familiar paths of their childhood, letting the landscape remind them both of who they had been before the world began telling them who they should become. River didn't push or probe, but simply offered their presence as a steady point of reference, a reminder of the story threads that had always been most genuinely Marcus Samuel. Sensing River's struggle with this new complexity, offered guidance during their morning sessions in the square. "Family stories are like root systems," he said, his weathered hands working on a particularly intricate section of tapestry where multiple threads had become impossibly tangled. "They run deeper and connect more extensively than other narratives. The healing happens not through dramatic intervention, but through patient presence, through creating conditions where authentic stories can remember themselves. The breakthrough came not through conversation, but through action, in the way that matched Marcus's natural learning style." River suggested they help repair the old playground equipment behind the community center, work that required both planning and physical engagement. As they sanded weathered wood and tightened loose bolts, Marcus began to speak more freely about his experiences at university. He talked about the pressure to choose a major that would lead to a prestigious career, even though his heart was drawn to subjects that others dismissed as impractical. He described the way he had started measuring his worth by external achievements rather than internal satisfaction, how he had begun to lose touch with the curiosity and wonder that had always been his greatest strengths. "I keep trying to write myself into other people's success stories," Marcus said one afternoon, pausing in his work to look at the swing set they had just restored. "But those stories don't fit. They're like wearing shoes that are the wrong size, you know. You can walk in them, but every step hurts." River felt their brother's story threads beginning to settle into healthier patterns, the authentic parts growing stronger, while the borrowed expectations began to loosen their grip. It was like watching a plant that had been forced into an unnatural shape gradually returning to its true form. Not quickly, but with the patient certainty of living things seeking their proper light. The healing wasn't dramatic or sudden. It came in small moments, Marcus laughing with genuine delight at a butterfly landing on his hand, his face relaxing into expressions River remembered from their childhood. It came in the way he began to speak about his future with curiosity rather than anxiety, exploring possibilities instead of defending predetermined paths. One evening, as they sat on the cottage porch, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance, Marcus turned to River with something like wonder in his voice. "I think I've been trying to live a story that was never mine to begin with," he said softly. "All this time I thought I had to choose between disappointing everyone or disappointing myself. But maybe there's a third option. Maybe there's a way to honor both the people who love me and the person I actually am." River felt their brother's story thread settling into a new configuration. Not perfect, but more honest, more integrated. Marcus still wanted adventure and achievement, but now these desires were rooted in his authentic interests rather than external expectations. His narrative had learned to include both triumph and disappointment, both bold gestures and quiet moments of reflection. As summer deepened and Marcus prepared to return to university, River understood that family story mending was perhaps the most complex and rewarding work they would ever undertake. It required holding love and truth in perfect balance, offering support without enabling, witnessing without trying to control outcomes. But it also offered the deepest satisfactions, the joy of seeing someone beloved remember their own authentic voice and begin to sing it with confidence once again. In the space between one firefly's flash and the next, River felt their understanding of story work expanding to include the intricate dance of helping those closest to them find their way home to themselves. The cottage settled into evening peace around them, stories whispering their good nights, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, River felt their own narrative growing stronger, more capable of holding both the complexity of family love and the patient work of helping stories remember their truest forms. The autumn after Marcus returned to university carried a different quality of light, as if the season itself understood that some stories were ready to unfold in new directions. River felt the change not as restlessness, but as a gentle stirring, like seeds that had been quietly preparing beneath winter soil, finally sensing their time to grow. The work with Marcus had revealed something essential about the nature of story healing. People needed more than individual mending. They needed spaces where their narratives could breathe together, where the act of sharing and witnessing could transform isolated struggles into collective wisdom. The idea for what would become the Story Cafe emerged slowly, growing from conversations with Samuel about the interconnectedness of all tales and quiet moments with grandmother, Marin as she prepared meals that somehow carried more nourishment than their ingredients should have allowed. River began to notice how food and stories moved through the community in similar ways, both offering sustenance, both creating connections, both capable of healing, when offered with genuine care. The revelation came during a particularly grey October afternoon, when River found themselves walking past the old baker's shop that had stood empty since Mr. Henley's retirement 3 years prior. The building seemed to pulse with gentle possibility, its boarded windows unable to contain the whispered memories of warm bread and morning conversations that had once filled its rooms. River pressed their palm against the weathered door and felt the space inside yearning for purpose, humming with the patient hope of places that remember how to nourish. Samuel, when River shared this discovery, smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone watching a student arrive at understanding through their own careful observation. "Some spaces are born to feed people," he said, his weathered hands smoothing a section of tapestry where multiple threads had learned to dance together. "Perhaps this one is ready to remember its calling, with your help to show it new ways to serve." The transformation happened gradually, with the same patient attention River had learned to bring to story mending. Marin contributed recipes that carried emotional flavors alongside their physical ingredients, while Samuel helped River understand how to create an environment where stories could move freely between people without losing their essential truth. The village carpenter, whose own story had been gently tended by River years before, offered his skills in exchange for the promise of morning coffee, and the kind of listening that made ordinary days feel significant. They painted the walls a color that seemed to shift between cream and gold depending on the light, installed shelves that would hold carefully chosen books alongside jars of homemade preserves, and arranged mismatched tables and chairs that invited lingering. River discovered that each piece of furniture carried its own story residue, and they learned to combine pieces whose narratives harmonized, creating seating arrangements that naturally encouraged the kind of conversations that mattered. The menu developed organically, growing from River's understanding of how different flavors could support different emotional states. Comfort soup that tasted of being held when frightened, courage bread, dense and warming that reminded people of their own capacity for bravery, clear mind tea blended with herbs that helped tangled thoughts settle into manageable patterns. Each item was prepared not just with ingredients, but with intention. River's gift allowing them to infuse the food with exactly the emotional nourishment each customer needed. On the morning they opened, River arrived before dawn to brew the first pot of coffee, watching steam rise in the lamplight like visible prayers. The familiar faces began arriving as word spread through the village's invisible network of connection. Mrs. Patterson, her story threads now woven with colors of quiet contentment, choosing a table by the window where morning light could warm her hands around her cup. Mr. Caldwell, the banker whose wonder had been gently rekindled, settling with his newspaper and a slice of what River had quietly named Discovery Cake, its flavors designed to remind him of childhood curiosity. The cafe found its rhythm naturally, becoming a place where the community's collective narrative could breathe and grow. River moved between tables with the same careful attention they brought to story mending, listening not just to words, but to the emotional undertones that revealed what each person truly needed. Sometimes it was simply witness, a space to share a small triumph or worry without judgment. Other times it was connection, the gentle introduction of one person's wisdom to another's need, facilitated through seemingly casual conversation. Young Thomas, now 16 and growing into his own quiet strength, became a regular, often arriving with homework that he claimed required the cafe's particular atmosphere to complete. River understood that what he actually needed was the gentle hum of community life, the reminder that he belonged to something larger than his own uncertainties. Clara, preparing for university entrance exams, discovered that her anxiety lessened when she studied surrounded by the soft murmur of other people's stories, as if the collective narrative of the cafe helped her remember her own capacity for learning and growth. The most profound discovery was how stories seemed to heal themselves when given the right environment. Problems that felt insurmountable when customers arrived often revealed their solutions through the simple act of being spoken aloud in a space that understood the sacred nature of human experience. River learned to create conditions for this natural healing without trying to direct it, offering presence and nourishment while trusting in the inherent wisdom of stories to find their own best expression. As winter approached and the cafe settled into the village's daily rhythm, River understood that they had created more than a business. They had woven themselves into the community's story tapestry in a new way, becoming a keeper of the space where individual narratives could meet and nourish each other. In the gentle hum of conversation and the soft clink of cups being set on saucers, River heard the sound of stories, learning to trust connection again, and somewhere in that harmony felt their own narrative growing stronger, more capable of holding both the complexity of human experience and the simple truth that everyone deserves to be heard. The cafe closed each evening with the satisfied exhaustion of good work completed, and River would stand for a moment in the doorway, watching the last light fade from the windows, feeling grateful for the privilege of tending this particular corner of the world's vast, interconnected story. The morning Elena first entered the Story Cafe, River felt the shift before they saw her. The air seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, as if the space itself recognized someone who understood the sacred nature of preserved memory. She moved with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to handling fragile things, her eyes the color of river stones, scanning the room with the careful attention of someone who saw stories in every weathered surface and well-worn chair. Elena ordered memory tea without reading the menu, as if she instinctively knew which blend would complement the work she carried in the leather satchel at her side. River watched her settle into the corner table where morning light fell softest, pulling out a small notebook and a collection of items wrapped in tissue paper. When she unwrapped the first object, a faded program from a school play dated 30 years prior, River tasted something they had never encountered before, the flavor of stories carefully preserved in their original form, held in trust for future generations who might need to remember. Over the following weeks, Elena became a regular presence, arriving each morning with the punctuality of someone whose work required absolute reliability. River learned to read the subtle signs of her craft, the way she handled aged paper with fingertips that never pressed too hard, the careful notation she made in margins that seemed to capture not just information, but the emotional residue of memory itself. Her story threads shimmered with colors River had never tasted, flavors that spoke of patient archival work and the deep satisfaction of saving narratives from oblivion. Their first real conversation began with a book. Elena noticed River's arrangement of the cafe's small library, the way volumes were organized not alphabetically, but according to some deeper principle of emotional compatibility. "You place them where they can breathe together," Elena observed, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of someone who understood that stories were living entities, requiring careful tending. River felt their heart quicken with recognition. Elena's observation wasn't casual, but born from the same sensitivity to narrative that River had spent years learning to trust. They began to share their understanding of story work, describing the delicate process of tending community threads and helping individual healing contribute to collective well-being. Elena listened with the quality of attention River had only experienced from Samuel, the kind of presence that made speaking feel like offering something precious to someone capable of holding it safely. Elena revealed herself gradually, sharing fragments of her work as a regional archivist, specializing in preservation of local narratives. She traveled to communities where personal histories were disappearing with their elders, where family stories existed only in fading photographs and half-remembered conversations. Her mission was to capture these narratives before they vanished entirely, but always with respect for their original form and context. Stories die when they stop being shared, Elena explained one quiet afternoon, her hands wrapped around her teacup with the reverence of someone holding something irreplaceable. But they also die when they're preserved incorrectly, when someone tries to freeze them in forms that don't allow for natural growth. The art is finding the balance between honoring what has been and allowing what needs to become. River felt the profound truth of Elena's words resonating with everything Samuel had taught them about the living nature of narratives. They began to discover how their approaches complemented each other. River's gift for sensing what stories needed in the present, combined with Elena's expertise in preserving authentic voices from the past. Where River wove connections between contemporary narratives, Elena maintained the integrity of historical threads that might otherwise be lost or distorted. Their first collaborative project emerged naturally when Mrs. Patterson mentioned her grandmother's recipe collection, handwritten cards that were becoming too fragile to handle safely. Elena showed River how to photograph each card in a way that captured not just the ingredients and instructions, but the emotional residue of countless family meals. River, in turn, helped Elena understand how the recipes could be gently shared with community members who carried similar food memories, creating connections between past and present without compromising the original's integrity. Working together, they established what Elena called the memory archive in the cafe's back room. Soft lighting protected fragile documents, while comfortable seating invited people to spend time with preserved narratives. Community members began bringing family treasures, letters from distant relatives, programs from local celebrations, photographs that captured moments of ordinary joy. Elena taught River the delicate techniques of preservation, while River helped Elena understand how archived stories could continue to nourish the living community. The relationship between them deepened with the patience of stories, learning to trust each other. Elena had spent years working alone, moving between communities with her careful preservation work, never staying long enough to see how protected narratives might bloom in their home soil. River had grown deep roots in one place, learning to tend the same story threads over time, watching how patient care could transform entire communities. "I've been thinking," Elena said one evening as they walked home through the village square, fireflies beginning their nightly dance around Samuel's oak tree, about what it might mean to combine our approaches. Your deep community work with my preservation experience. There are so many places where stories are struggling, where they need both immediate care and long-term protection. River felt Elena's vision settling into their heart, like a seed finding fertile ground. The cafe had become a living demonstration that story work could transform communities from within, but there were countless places where such work was desperately needed. The thought of expanding their reach, of carrying their combined gifts to communities hungry for narrative healing, carried both excitement and the bittersweet flavor of growth that requires letting go of familiar comfort. As autumn painted the world in shades of letting go and holding on, River understood that their work was ready to expand beyond familiar boundaries. Elena's presence had shown them that preservation and healing were not separate arts, but complementary aspects of the same sacred work. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, River felt their story threads weaving together with Elena's in patterns that spoke of partnership and shared purpose, of individual gifts finding their fullest expression through connection with another's complementary strengths. The cafe settled into evening peace around them, stories whispering their good nights, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, River felt their own narrative preparing for its next chapter, one that would carry the art of story healing far beyond the familiar boundaries of home. The decision to travel came not as a sudden inspiration, but as the natural next breath in a conversation that had been building through winter's quiet months. Letters had begun arriving at the cafe, carried by travelers who had somehow heard whispers of the work River and Elena were doing together. A mountain village where old feuds had calcified into silence. A coastal town where rapid development had severed connections to ancestral stories. Communities where the story threads had grown so thin that people had forgotten how to nourish each other. Elena spread the letters across the cafe's largest table like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved, each one carrying the particular desperation of places where narrative had fractured beyond individual repair. River read them with their fingertips as much as their eyes, tasting the loneliness and disconnection that had prompted strangers to reach out to other strangers, hoping for help they couldn't quite name. The preparation took months of careful attention. Eleanor researched each community's history, understanding the particular wounds that had led to their current isolation. River worked with Samuel to understand how their gift might function in unfamiliar environments, learning to sense story threads even when surrounded by narratives they had never tasted before. Grandmother Maren contributed recipes that could be adapted to local ingredients while maintaining their emotional nourishment, understanding that food would be crucial for creating spaces where healing could begin. They began with Millbrook, a town that sat beside a river, which had learned the language of patience. 2 bridges crossed the water, one old and stone-built, one modern and sleek, and the community itself had quietly divided along invisible lines that no one could quite explain anymore. People called the split practical, but River could taste the stale ache of an old misunderstanding that had hardened into habit. The healing began not through dramatic reconciliation, but through the gentle restoration of shared experiences. River brewed 2 different coffees at the market stall between the bridge paths, one with bright citrus notes, one with deep chocolate warmth, leaving small cards that simply read Old Bridge Brew and New Bridge Roast. No commentary, just presence. When people from both sides found themselves tasting both flavors, conversations began to flow like water, finding its natural course. Elena discovered a photograph of the old bridge keeper in the town archives, a man whose hands were sheened with river light, whose eyes held the particular kindness of someone who had spent years clearing debris after storms. She pinned a small print to the coffee stall, and an older woman touched the edge of the image, like someone greeting a long-absent friend. By evening, the old bridge saw more foot traffic than it had in months, not because anyone had been convinced of anything, but because stories had remembered each other. Their second destination was a coastal village, where wind farm blades turned like quiet metronomes against a wide sky. Progress had arrived with its necessary hum, but in the process, the old fishing tales and sea legends had been relegated to dusty corners, replaced by promises of a more modern future. River tasted profound rootlessness, a communal emptiness, where rich traditional soil had been replaced by something sterile and efficient. Elena found archives of faded photographs showing proud fishermen and women mending nets, faces etched with stories that had been silenced by the march of progress. River organized an evening by the low dunes, passing out kite strings weighted with small cloth streamers where people could write names or wishes. Children and grandparents wrote of ships and sons, daughters and debts forgiven, then raised their lines to catch the steady breeze. Someone began humming an old tune the lighthouse keeper had supposedly sung during storms, and without prompting, others joined in until it became unclear whether the people were singing to the wind or the wind to them. The third community presented the most delicate challenge, a mountain hamlet where love struggled to breathe beneath layers of unspoken grief. Here, a family story had collapsed around a missing chair. A boy who had drowned years before in a quarry, now fenced and posted with warning signs. River and Elena were invited into a house where laughter had learned to step lightly, where kindness moved carefully around invisible obstacles. Elena asked permission to examine a box everyone knew about, but no one opened anymore. Inside lay a tangle of saved things, a baseball with a smudge shaped like a crescent moon, a ticket stub, a cassette tape labeled in childish handwriting. When they finally found courage to press play, the speakers offered a boy's wordless humming. Not a song anyone could name, but a line of sound that rose and fell like someone tracing the shape of a hillside with their voice. River served tea that tasted of rain on tin roofs and placed their hand palm up on the table, creating space for grief to be witnessed, without being fixed. As the seasons turned and they moved between communities, River and Eleanor began to understand that they were developing something more than individual interventions. They were pioneering a replicable approach to collective healing, learning that every community's wounds were different, but the healing process followed similar patterns. Create safe spaces, honor existing stories, offer nourishment without judgment, and trust in people's inherent desire for connection. On quiet evenings in guest cottages and small motels, River made what they called story sandwiches, slipping frayed letters between books that steadied and soothed, humming to the stack as if tucking in a child. Elena labeled envelopes in her neat hand, and sometimes when the day had been heavy, they would step outside and name constellations incorrectly on purpose, just to let laughter loose into the patient darkness. By summer's end, their satchels were lined with fragments of community life, photographs, transcribed recipes, recordings of laughter braided with wind. They had learned that healing happened not through dramatic intervention, but through patient presence, through creating conditions where natural connections could flourish. Each community had taught them something new about the delicate art of helping stories remember how to dance together. As they prepared for the journey home, River felt their own story threads weaving more deeply with Elena's, a tapestry of shared purpose that had grown stronger through witnessing so many different forms of human connection and disconnection. The world they understood now was an endless collection of narratives, each one precious, each one deserving of care. And somewhere in the space between one community's healing and the next, River felt a new vision stirring, a dream of a place where all these gathered stories could take root and continue growing, nourished by the endless human capacity for connection and wonder. The vision came to them on the train ride home, as countryside rolled past their window like pages turning in a familiar book. River watched Elena's reflection in the glass, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea, her eyes distant with the particular expression of someone whose mind was building something beautiful in spaces others couldn't see. Between them on the small table lay their collection of community fragments, pressed flowers from the mountain hamlet, a smooth stone from the coastal village, a photograph of Millbrook's bridges reflected in still water. "What if," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying the tentative quality of someone offering a dream that might be too precious to speak aloud. "Stories could literally take root and grow? Not just heal in conversation, but flourish in soil and sunlight, where people could walk through them and let them change with the seasons." River felt their heart quicken with recognition. The idea had been stirring in their own imagination throughout their travels, growing stronger with each community they had helped. They had seen how powerful storywork could be when applied with patience and skill, but they had also sensed the limitations of temporary interventions. The satchels at their feet, heavier with kindness than with objects, seemed to hum with possibility. They came home at the blue edge of evening, the cafe windows giving back their light like a familiar embrace. Samuel waited in the doorway, with the patient satisfaction of someone watching students discover truths he had always known they would find. When River and Elena spread their gathered treasures across the long table, photographs breathed back into clarity, recipes copied in careful hands, scraps of ribbon from kites that had flown prayers into coastal wind, he leaned forward with interest that tasted of deep roots and longer seasons. "Stories want to be embodied," Samuel said, his weathered fingers tracing patterns in the air that seemed to sketch the outline of their vision. "They're tired of living only in words and memory. They want to feel rain on their faces, to watch sunrise paint their walls, to host the kind of conversations that happen when people feel truly at home." Grandmother Maren listened with eyes that smiled, even when her mouth didn't. And after hearing tales of shared meals and mended hearts, she offered her own simple wisdom. "The earth remembers how to grow, if you give it the right soil. The land found them rather than the other way around." Eleanor heard about it from a traveling librarian, who mentioned 5 acres of gentle hills and old-growth trees just beyond the village edge, where someone had once planned to build a retreat center before life took them in different directions. River felt the rightness of it before they even saw it, the way the story threads of the place seemed to hum with patient anticipation. The property held a small farmhouse, with rooms that caught light like cupped hands, a barn whose weathered boards remembered decades of careful use, and gardens that had gone wild but not forgotten their original purpose. Apple trees lined the eastern border, their branches heavy with fruit that tasted of stories told beneath their shade. A stream wandered through the lower meadow, its voice carrying the particular music of water that has learned to sing to itself. Moonlight rested on thistles and volunteer clover, and the ground smelled like quiet promises. Samuel knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. "Good bones," he murmured. "This soil remembers gardens." River tasted the faint sweetness of old dill and summer beans, the shy spice of marigolds that had once kept watch. It felt like finding a lullaby in a drawer. The transformation began with the same patient attention River and Elena had learned to bring to community healing. They didn't impose their vision on the land, but listened to what it wanted to become, understanding that the most powerful story spaces emerged from collaboration between human intention and natural wisdom. Elena researched the property's history, discovering layers of narrative that stretched back generations. A family farm, a brief stint as an artist's colony, years of quiet abandonment that had allowed wild things to reclaim their rightful places. Word moved through the village not by announcement, but by the quiet contagion of shared purpose. People arrived with memory plants in their arms and stories in their mouths. Mrs. Patterson brought a shoebox of crocus bulbs from her grandmother's yard, each one a small promise of late winter courage. Mr. Caldwell arrived with rosemary, its resin bright as old summers, and laid it by the gate without fuss. Miss Eleanor contributed a pot of violets, saying only, "They like to listen," and set them near a bench that seemed to have been waiting. River layered what they called soil sandwiches at the garden's edges, leaves, straw, and the softest shreds of unreadable newsprint rescued from the library's discard pile, whispering as they built, the way they did when tucking a weary book between steadier spines. Eleanor sketched paths that curved like sentences, seeking their right ending, placing benches where the light would pause in late afternoon, inviting strangers to linger long enough to become neighbors. Samuel wove an archway from willow, hands steady, letting the green wands decide their own curves. Beneath it, Elena hung weatherproof cards for what became the memory arbor, succinct fragments in honest handwriting, the summer we forgave each other under the pear tree. The night the power went out and we learned the names of stars. The smell of Dad's coat in rain. She taught River how to seal ink against weather, without sealing away breath. And River taught Elena how to sense which memories liked one another, pairing cards in gentle constellations. At the garden's center, they placed a shallow stone basin on a tripod of cedar, with a discreet pump that lifted water to fall over copper leaves Samuel had shaped by hand. The spill was tuned by careful adjustments until it made the domestic music of rivering, kitchen sink and porch gutter, bath drawn and kettle poured. The first time it ran, Maren stood back and closed her eyes. "It sounds like my mother saying, 'Hush now,'" she whispered. And River felt the air sweeten with recognition. Elena integrated elements from each community they had visited. A small stone cairn in memory of the mountain hamlet's lost boy, a section of river stones arranged to echo the flow of Millbrook's bridges, a patch of hardy coastal grasses that carried the resilience of the seafaring village. These weren't literal reproductions but symbolic echoes, gentle reminders that all stories were connected, that local narratives were part of a larger, global tapestry. They planted a path free of signs and heavy with suggestion, time brushing visitors' ankles, a fringe of lemon balm inviting fingers. River tucked seed packets labeled in their careful script, "Listen, begin, mend, share." The labels were less instructions than invitations, talismans against rush. Nearby, a small mound became the napping hill, just high enough to change a child's horizon, just soft enough for adults to surrender for a minute. Thomas painted a shy sign, "Nap if you need," and stuck it in the grass with a seriousness that made laughter bloom easy as clover. When the first crocuses pushed through snow-stiff earth, the garden opened without speeches. People drifted in, as if they were arriving at the edge of a dream they'd visited before. Someone set a sandwich on a bench for a midday pause, and finding they were not alone, cut it quietly in half without calculation. A young mother walked the path twice, then sat near the violets and began to hum without realizing she'd begun. An older man carried a photograph to the memory arbor, stood there a long time, and left with his shoulders easier. River learned to read the garden's needs with the same sensitivity they brought to individual story work. Some sections required more solitude, others thrived on the energy of gathered community. The rosemary by the gate became the unofficial station for second chances. Those who paused there often found the words to turn back toward hard conversations. The fountain's patient rain taught restless minds to settle, and children discovered that their imaginary friends became more vivid in certain corners, while adults found that memories they thought they had, forgotten, surfaced gently when they sat by the stream. As the seasons turned, the garden changed not just in its plants and weather, but in the stories it hosted. Spring brought tales of new beginnings and second chances, while autumn drew narratives of harvest and letting go. Winter offered space for the deepest stories, the ones that needed darkness and quiet to reveal their essential truths. Summer hummed with the energy of growth and connection, as community members gathered for evening storytelling around the fire pit River had built near the old apple trees. On quiet evenings when the last visitors had returned to their own lives, River and Eleanor would walk the paths together, listening to the garden's nighttime stories. Plants whispered to each other in languages older than human speech, while the stream carried fragments of the day's conversations toward the sea. A moth crossed the lantern's circle of light, a small, soft envoy from the night, and River watched it vanish into the deeper dark, with no ache at its leaving, only the rightness of cycles. The story garden had become more than they had ever imagined, not just a place where stories could be healed, but where they could be born, nurtured, and allowed to evolve in response to the endless creativity of life itself. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt their own story weaving itself deeper into this living tapestry, becoming part of something larger and more enduring than any individual narrative could achieve alone. The garden breathed. The town breathed with it. Somewhere a new memory was finding its first words, and somewhere else an old one began to let go of its sharpness and become kind, growing the quiet revolution one bench, one bloom, one shared whisper at a time. The teaching began not with intention but with recognition, the way morning light reveals what was always there. River noticed it first in small gestures that carried the particular quality of story work, learned through experience rather than instruction. Mrs. Patterson, whose own narrative threads had been gently rewoven years before, now naturally created space for a young mother struggling with bedtime anxieties, her voice carrying the same patient presence River remembered from their own early learning with Samuel. A young mother named Asha arrived most mornings with her daughter Noor, whose worries clustered like small clouds around her shoulders. Noor examined every step through the garden, counting stones and checking shadows twice, while Asha apologized with the quiet tension of someone who had forgotten that caution could be wisdom rather than weakness. River didn't correct either of them. Instead, they invited Asha to help prepare the seed packets for spring planting. Small envelopes folded from pages the library no longer needed. As Asha read River's careful labels, "Listen, begin, mend, share," something in her shoulders softened. She added her own words in looping script: breathe, wait, try again, rest. Noor drew tiny suns on the corners and for the first time that week forgot to count her steps. River showed Asha how to listen for which paths Noor already trusted, instead of persuading her toward braver routes. How to create space for courage to emerge naturally, rather than demanding it appear on schedule. When Noor hesitates at the willow arch, River suggested gently, try saying we can stand together and let the leaves decide instead of don't be afraid. The next morning, River watched Noor step beneath the green fringe and reach back not for reassurance but for celebration, her small hand finding her mother's with the confidence of someone who had learned that the ground would hold. A retired teacher named Lionel began appearing at twilight when the garden practiced its lullabies. He carried the particular sadness of someone who had spent decades delivering lessons like announcements instead of invitations, his story threads heavy with regret for connections missed and wonder stifled. "I used to make them memorize poems," he confided one evening, watching the fountain's patient glimmer. "I can still recite every line, but I think I miss the spaces between words, the places where meaning lives. River placed a book of poetry in his weathered hands, pages thin enough to let light through, and suggested he read not aloud but near, simply allowing the words to move through him without destination. Lionel settled on a bench beneath the memory arbor, and children began drifting close on their own, drawn by the rhythm of his breathing more than any text. Within weeks, he had transformed the community bulletin board at the cafe, shifting announcements so each had breathing room. "I think they'll be easier to see this way," he said, smiling at his small rebellion against crowding. Elena, watching these organic transformations with her archivist's eye for patterns, was the first to name what they were witnessing. "The work is multiplying itself," she observed one evening as they walked the garden paths together. "People aren't just being healed by what we do. They're learning to do it themselves." River felt this truth settling into their understanding, like seeds finding fertile ground. What they had initially seen as individual healing was revealing itself as something far more profound, a community learning to tend its own narrative health. The story garden had become a living classroom, where the art of story healing was being passed from heart to heart through invitation and example, rather than formal instruction. The recognition led to their first conscious teaching when Clara, now an educator herself, approached River after a particularly meaningful evening around the fire pit. "I have students who carry such heavy things," she said, her voice holding the concern of someone who understood that academic learning couldn't flourish when hearts were too wounded to focus. "Could you teach me how to create spaces where their stories might feel safe to breathe?" River's initial impulse was to defer, to suggest that such work required years of training and gifts that couldn't be easily transmitted. But Samuel's patient presence in their memory reminded them that the most profound teachings often emerged from genuine need rather than formal curriculum. They began what Elena playfully called the gentle curriculum, not structured, lessons but experiences that allowed people to discover their own capacity for story healing. Clara learned through careful observation and shared practice, watching River interact with garden visitors and noting not specific techniques, but the quality of presence they brought to each encounter. She discovered the difference between listening that sought to fix and listening that simply witnessed, between offering advice and creating space for people to discover their own wisdom. "The hardest part," Clara confided after her first week of practice, "is trusting that people already know what they need. I want to help so badly that I sometimes try to solve their problems instead of helping them remember their own strength." River smiled with recognition, remembering their own early mistakes. "The healing doesn't come from us," they said gently. "It comes from being truly seen and heard. We just create conditions where that kind of seeing becomes possible." Marcus, during one of his weekend visits home from university, observed a teaching session and offered his own insight with the clarity that came from his own healing journey. "You're not really teaching them techniques," he said thoughtfully. "You're teaching them to trust something they already know, but have forgotten they know." This became the foundation of River's approach, helping people remember their own innate understanding of what stories needed, their natural capacity for the kind of presence that allowed healing to unfold. Some learned through hands-on practice in the garden, discovering how tending plants could teach patience for narrative healing. Others found their gifts through food preparation, learning how intention and care could be infused into nourishment that fed more than physical hunger. A teenager named Mira arrived with lightning in her notebook and the fierce impatience of someone who wanted to fix everything immediately. River recognized the love hiding inside her urgency and gave her responsibility for the fire pit by the apple trees. Mira learned to coax flame from damp tinder, to wait for the coals that hold warmth long after fire has spent itself. "Big is easy," River observed. "Steady is harder." Mira began hosting evening story circles, keeping the flame small enough that people could speak without shouting, warm enough that they stayed. Her notebook softened around the edges, as she learned to write down not only what burned bright, but what glowed with lasting warmth. As the circle of story healers grew, River began to see how individual efforts were creating a network of support that extended far beyond the garden's boundaries. Mrs. Chen developed an extraordinary ability to help people process grief through comfort, food preparation, her kitchen becoming a sanctuary where sorrow could be transformed into nourishment. The village carpenter discovered that working with wood alongside troubled teenagers created space for conversations that couldn't happen in formal settings. Samuel, now moving with the deliberate grace of ancient trees, would often sit near the willow arch with eyes closed, listening to the garden's evolving song. "This is how wisdom spreads," he said softly one afternoon, his weathered hand gesturing toward a group sharing their experiences with gentle honesty. Not through instruction, but through invitation. Not by being taught, but by being trusted to learn. Monthly gatherings in the garden became opportunities for story healers to support and learn from each other, sharing challenges and celebrating discoveries. River found themselves facilitating rather than leading these sessions, creating space for collective wisdom to emerge rather than dispensing advice from authority. Elena documented this organic expansion with careful attention, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented, a community-wide transformation in how people related to each other's stories. Her record showed not just individual healing, but collective change, as if the entire village was learning a new language of empathy and connection. One evening, as autumn painted the garden in shades of letting go and holding on, River stood at the edge of the gathering circle and realized their role was shifting once again. They were no longer primarily a healer or even a teacher, but a keeper of space where others could discover and develop their own gifts. The work was becoming self-sustaining, carried forward by people who had learned to trust their own capacity for creating conditions where stories could heal. Children who learned to share their stories safely at school carried that sense of being heard into their families. Adults who discovered their capacity for narrative healing began creating similar spaces in workplaces and community organizations. The gentle revolution was spreading through invisible networks of connection, transforming how the entire community understood the sacred nature of human experience. As the evening deepened and the last stories were shared around the dying fire, River felt a profound sense of completion mixed with anticipation. The work they had begun as a child, tasting stories in their grandmother's cottage, had grown into something far larger than they could have imagined. A community had learned to tend its own narrative health, creating conditions where every story could find the nourishment it needed to flourish. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt their own story preparing for its next evolution, ready to trust in the wisdom of natural cycles and the endless human capacity for growth and connection. The garden whispered its nighttime lullabies, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, new story healers were discovering their gifts, preparing to carry this ancient work into an ever-expanding circle of care and understanding. The revolution was no longer theirs to lead, but theirs to witness, as countless gentle hands learned to weave the world's stories back together, one thread at a time. The deeper stories revealed themselves like ancient roots exposed after a gentle rain, patient and complex, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of daily life that they had become invisible as breathing. River felt their presence in the way certain conversations always stopped, at the same invisible boundaries, in the particular quality of silence that settled over families during holiday gatherings, in the stories that were never told but somehow shaped everything that was. These were different from the individual wounds River had learned to tend with such care. These were the narratives that entire communities had agreed to carry without speaking, the inherited beliefs that passed from generation to generation, like family recipes, their original ingredients long forgotten, but their effect still shaping every meal. River tasted them in the spaces between words, in the way people's shoulders held themselves, in the particular exhaustion that came not from working too hard, but from carrying burdens that belonged to ghosts. The recognition came gradually, like watching dawn paint the sky in colors that had always been there but needed the right light to become visible. Samuel, now moving with the deliberate grace of someone whose time was becoming precious, helped River understand what they were sensing. "Some stories grow so deep they become the soil itself," he said one morning, his weathered hands working on a tapestry section where multiple threads had become so intertwined they seemed to be breathing together. "You cannot pull them up without disturbing everything that grows in them, but you can tend the earth around them, creating conditions where healthier growth becomes possible." The first deep story that asked for River's attention belonged to the Ashford family, whose members had been arriving at the cafe for months, carrying a particular heaviness that tasted of unfinished sentences and careful distances. 3 generations would sit at the same table, choosing their words like people walking on ice, their love for each other evident, but somehow unable to find its natural expression. River noticed how they never quite looked directly at each other, how conversations stopped whenever certain topics brushed too close to something unnamed. Elena, with her archivist's sensitivity to family silences, recognized the signs. "There's something they've agreed not to remember," she observed quietly, watching the grandmother's hands fold and unfold a napkin with nervous precision. The kind of story that gets buried so deep, it becomes part of the foundation, holding everything up but never seeing light. River began creating space for the Ashfords without pushing for revelation, understanding that some invitations could only be extended through presence, never words. They would ensure the family's favorite table remained available, would brew tea that tasted of courage without demanding bravery, would move through the cafe with the quality of attention that made difficult truths feel safer to approach. The healing began not through conversation, but through the gradual recognition that some spaces could hold complexity without requiring resolution. The breakthrough came through the youngest member, a teenager named Alex, who had inherited the family's careful distance, but had not yet learned to accept it as permanent. During a quiet afternoon, while helping River arrange books in the cafe's small library, Alex began speaking about their great-grandfather, a man whose photograph sat on the family mantel, but whose story had never been shared. "He came back from the war differently," Alex said, their voice carrying the particular weight of family mythology. "Everyone says he was a hero, but no one talks about what kind of hero or what he did, or why he never talked about it himself. It's like we're all protecting a secret that none of us actually know." River felt the deep story beginning to surface, not the traumatic details that had been buried, but the family's unconscious agreement to carry unnamed shame across generations. They didn't push for more information, but simply created space for Alex to voice what had been felt, but never spoken. Over time, other family members began joining these conversations, not to uncover the great-grandfather's specific experiences, but to acknowledge how his unprocessed pain had shaped their family's relationship with emotion itself. The healing didn't require dramatic revelation or forgiveness. Instead, it came through the gradual recognition that they could honor their ancestors' sacrifice without inheriting his silence, that love could be expressed directly rather than through protective distance. The family's story threads began to weave together more naturally, not erasing the past, but creating space for healthier patterns to emerge. Another deep story emerged through the community's relationship with the old textile mill, whose abandoned building sat at the village's edge, like a question no one wanted to answer. River could taste the complex flavors surrounding the mill's memory, pride mixed with shame, nostalgia tangled with resentment, the particular bitterness of economic wounds that had never been allowed to heal properly. Some remembered the mill as a source of steady employment and community pride. Others carried stories of exploitation and dangerous working conditions. The official historical marker offered sanitized facts that satisfied no one, creating a narrative vacuum where competing memories struggled for validation. River didn't attempt to reconcile these different perspectives, but instead created opportunities for them to coexist. They organized evening gatherings in the story garden, where people could share fragments of mill-related memories without debate or judgment. Some brought photographs of proud workers. Others shared stories of accidents that had been quietly covered up. The healing came not through agreement, but through the recognition that complex institutions could hold multiple truths simultaneously. Elena documented these sessions with careful attention, understanding that they were witnessing the community, learning to hold nuanced narratives rather than simplified versions of its own history. The mill story didn't need to become entirely positive or negative. It needed to become complete, acknowledging both its contributions and its failures as part of the village's authentic heritage. The most challenging deep story River encountered was woven into the community's relationship with worthiness itself, a pervasive narrative that suggested some people deserved care and attention, while others did not. This wasn't spoken aloud but lived in subtle hierarchies, in whose stories were listened to and whose were dismissed. in the way certain families' struggles were met with sympathy, while others faced quiet judgment. This work required extraordinary delicacy because it challenged assumptions that many people had never consciously examined. River began by modeling a different approach, offering the same quality of attention to every person who entered the cafe or garden, regardless of their social position or the nature of their struggles. They created rituals that celebrated ordinary moments and common experiences, helping people recognize the inherent value in stories that had been dismissed as unremarkable. The change happened gradually, like seasons shifting. People began noticing when they made assumptions about whose voices mattered, and began questioning inherited hierarchies that had never been consciously chosen. The community's capacity for empathy expanded as individuals learned to recognize their own worth reflected in others' experiences. As winter deepened and the garden entered its season of rest, River understood that working with deep stories had fundamentally changed their approach to healing. These narratives couldn't be mended like individual wounds or nourished like simple hungers. They required a different kind of presence, one that could witness complexity without trying to resolve it, that could hold space for contradictions and partial truths. Samuel, spending more time in contemplative silence, offered final guidance through gentle modeling rather than instruction. "The deepest stories are like underground rivers," he said during one of their walks through the snow-covered garden. "You cannot see them directly, but you can sense their movement by watching what grows above them. Your work is to tend the surface conditions so that what flows beneath can nourish rather than erode." River felt this wisdom settling into their understanding, like seeds finding fertile ground. The community had learned not just to heal individual narratives, but to examine the deeper currents that shaped collective experience. People were beginning to question inherited assumptions, to create space for more complex and honest versions of their shared story. On the longest night of the year, as the story garden rested under winter's gentle blanket, River stood among the bare apple trees and felt something profound shifting in the invisible tapestry that held the community together. The deep stories were still there, still complex and sometimes painful, but they were no longer ruling from the shadows. They had been brought into the light where they could be witnessed, acknowledged, and gradually transformed through the patient work of collective attention. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt their own story preparing for its next evolution, understanding that the work of healing extended far beyond individual wounds to encompass the very foundations upon which communities built their sense of identity and belonging. The garden whispered its nighttime lullabies, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, ancient stories were learning to trust the light, preparing to transform not just how people related to each other, but how they understood the sacred nature of truth itself. Spring returned, with the gentle insistence of stories that had learned to trust their own timing, carrying with it the scent of apple blossoms and the particular quality of light that makes promises feel possible. River found Samuel in the garden earlier each morning now, his weathered hands resting open in his lap, like empty cups waiting to be filled by whatever the dawn might offer. His presence had changed, grown more translucent somehow, as if he were already beginning the delicate work of becoming part of the larger story he had spent his life tending. "The greatest story weavers," Samuel said one morning as they walked the curved paths while dew still collected like tiny lanterns on the thyme, eventually learn to become transparent. Not invisible but clear, like a window that lets light pass through without claiming credit for the illumination. River listened with the quality of attention they had learned from years of sitting with stories that needed witnessing. Samuel's voice carried the particular authority of someone who had learned to speak only essential truths, each word polished smooth by careful consideration. "Window, not portrait," Samuel continued, his weathered fingers tracing patterns in the air that seemed to sketch the outline of wisdom too subtle for ordinary language. "Bowl, not banner. Let what needs to pass through you pass. Don't catch it to prove you held it." He led River to his workshop, where the great tapestry lay completed on the wide table, its intricate patterns finally revealing their full design. But what caught River's attention was a small space in the weaving, a deliberate opening where no thread crossed. Samuel noticed their gaze and smiled with the satisfaction of someone watching a student discover truth through their own careful observation. "This is the part that confuses the impatient," he said softly. "They want to fill every gap, to prove their usefulness by leaving no space untouched. But the light does its own work if you let it in. Leave windows. Trust light." From his drawer, Samuel withdrew an empty frame, weathered wood with a thin backboard and no glass. He handed it to River with the same reverence he might have used for his most precious tools. "A place to be seen without being captured," he explained. "Sometimes the shape of attention is enough." River carried the frame back to the cafe, where they placed it on the mantel between the coffee grinder and the jar of lemon peels. People noticed immediately, looking for a picture that wasn't there. Over the following days, River watched the frame do its patient work. Strangers stood near it and spoke in softer tones. Children lifted it up to hold around each other's faces, giggling until they made a kind of reverence without realizing it. The empty space seemed to amplify whatever was placed within it, making ordinary moments feel sacred through the simple act of being framed. Samuel's teaching deepened through demonstration rather than instruction. River watched him interact with garden visitors, with a quality of presence that seemed to amplify their own capacity for insight and healing. He didn't offer advice or guidance, but simply held space with such clarity that people found themselves accessing wisdom they didn't know they possessed. A young father struggling with his son's behavioral challenges sat with Samuel for an hour beneath the memory arbor, neither of them speaking more than a few words. River observed from a respectful distance, tasting the shift in the man's story threads as something hard began to soften. By the time he left, his shoulders had relaxed and his eyes held a different quality of understanding. Not because Samuel had given him answers, but because the transparent quality of Samuel's presence had created space for the man's own wisdom to surface. "I got out of the way," Samuel explained simply when River asked what had happened, and let his own knowledge remember itself. River began practicing this transparency in small ways, learning to catch themselves when they felt the urge to offer solutions before being asked. They discovered how often their desire to help was actually a subtle form of control, an assumption that they knew better than the stories themselves what kind of healing was needed. The practice was more challenging than any technique River had learned. It required releasing attachment to outcomes, trusting that stories contained their own intelligence about timing and direction. Sometimes this meant sitting with people in pain without trying to ease their discomfort. Other times it meant allowing conversations to move in directions that seemed unproductive, but somehow served purposes River couldn't immediately understand. One afternoon, a woman named Sarah arrived at the garden carrying grief so profound it seemed to bend the light around her. River's instinct was to offer comfort, to guide her toward the healing practices that had helped others with similar losses. Instead, remembering Samuel's teaching, they simply invited Sarah to sit, wherever felt right, and offered to remain nearby if she wanted company. Sarah chose a spot beneath the apple trees where fallen blossoms created a soft carpet of pink and white. She sat in silence for nearly 2 hours, occasionally weeping, sometimes staring at the sky through the branches above. River remained at a respectful distance, not focusing healing energy, but simply being present without agenda, like the empty frame that made space for whatever needed to be seen. When Sarah finally spoke, it wasn't to ask for help, but to comment on how the falling petals reminded her of snow. This led to a gentle conversation about seasons and cycles, about the way trees trusted in renewal, even after the harshest winters. By the time she left, Sarah's grief remained but had somehow transformed from a weight she carried alone into a natural part of the larger cycle of love and loss that connected her to all living things. Samuel, witnessing this interaction from across the garden, nodded with quiet satisfaction. "You see? The story knew exactly what it needed. Your job was simply to create conditions for that knowing to emerge." As summer deepened, Samuel began to move with the deliberate grace of ancient trees, his body growing frail but his spirit shining with an even deeper clarity. He spent longer hours in contemplative silence, often sitting beneath the willow arch with his eyes closed but alert, listening to music only he could hear. River felt the shift in him not as absence, but as a thinning veil, more of the sky showing through. "Rest is a stitch," Samuel said one afternoon, his voice soft as leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. "Make it part of your pattern." Take days when you refuse to be useful, and notice how the garden goes on blessing without you. From his pocket, he withdrew a small strip of linen with a single word embroidered in his careful hand. Leave. He tied it around River's wrist like a gentle reminder. Too easy to forget this verb, he said. You know how to arrive. Practice leaving. His presence began to thin the way winter does when you start to hear water under ice. He came less often to the cafe, more often to the quiet edges of the garden. When he did speak, it was with the simplicity of lullabies, his words carrying the weight of someone who had learned to say only what was essential. On a warm evening in late summer, as fireflies began their nightly dance around the memory arbor, River found Samuel resting beneath the ancient oak, his breathing shallow, his weathered hands folded peacefully in his lap. River sat beside him, holding his frail hand, feeling the quiet rhythm of a life preparing to join the larger story. There was no fear, no struggle, only a profound peace that tasted of deep roots and endless skies. River felt Samuel's story threads dissolving not into nothingness, but into the very fabric of the garden, into the hum of the earth, into the gentle whisper of the wind through the leaves. He was becoming part of the larger tapestry, a transparent presence that would continue to nourish and guide without needing a physical form. Whatever I have left to teach, Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the fountain's patient song, will come to you when you aren't looking. You'll be making tea or tying a shoe and you'll know. Not because it was mine, but because it was always yours, waiting for you to notice. His breathing grew softer, more spaced, until it became indistinguishable from the evening breeze moving through the apple trees. River felt the moment of transition not as an ending, but as a gentle expansion. Samuel's presence spreading through the garden like morning light, becoming part of every path and bench, every story that would ever be shared beneath the willow's patient shade. The next morning, the garden woke with an unusual clarity, a heightened sense of presence in every leaf and stone. Samuel was gone, but his story threads were everywhere, woven into the light that fell through the willow arch, carried on the music of the fountain, present in the quiet strength of the old oak. The empty frame on the cafe mantel seemed to hold his absence like a blessing, creating space for his transparent presence to continue its gentle work. River now moved through the garden with a new kind of grace, their own story threads shimmering with deeper transparency. They no longer sought to mend or nourish or even teach in the same way. Their role had shifted to one of profound witnessing, of holding space for stories to find their own way, to remember their own wisdom, to weave themselves into the larger tapestry of life with an effortless beauty that only true transparency could allow. The community of story healers continued to grow and flourish, no longer needing River's direct guidance, but carrying forward the work with their own authentic voices. Mrs. Patterson held tea gatherings for new mothers, her presence radiating the warmth of someone who had learned to trust her own capacity for nurturing. Lionel led poetry walks through the garden, his voice carrying the joy of someone who had rediscovered the spaces between words where meaning lived and breathed. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt their own narrative becoming a quiet hum in the larger song of the world, a transparent presence through which the endless, intricate and beautiful narratives of humanity could flow. Samuel's final teaching had taken root, the understanding that the deepest service came not from doing, but from being, not from controlling, but from trusting, not from healing others, but from creating conditions where all stories could remember their own inherent wholeness. The garden whispered its nighttime lullabies, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, Samuel's transparent presence continued its eternal work, woven so deeply into the fabric of the place that every story shared beneath the stars carried a trace of his patient wisdom, his endless capacity for holding space, his profound trust in the story's own ability to find their way home to themselves. The quiet revolution had woven itself so deeply into the village's daily rhythm that most people couldn't pinpoint when ordinary interactions had become extraordinary acts of care. River noticed it in the way conversations naturally slowed to make space for listening, in how conflicts transformed from battles to be won into puzzles to be solved together, in the particular quality of attention that children now brought to their elders' stories and adults offered to their neighbors' struggles. The changes appeared in clothing so ordinary they seemed invisible. At the clinic, Nurse Alba had replaced the first line on intake forms with a simple question that transformed everything. What would you like us to know about you today? People arrived with symptoms and left with their dignity folded more carefully around them, their stories witnessed alongside their physical needs. The hardware store owner placed a basket of scrap wood by the door with a sign reading, "Take what you need for small repairs," and beside it, a notebook filled with sketches of fixes made and confidence restored. Clara, now the school principal, had woven storywork so seamlessly into education that children learned empathy alongside arithmetic. Her Friday afternoon circles began with a moment of humming, a wordless lullaby that reminded everyone they were still learning how to be kind. Students discovered that their struggles with friendship echoed in older children's experiences with identity, while teenagers found themselves naturally mentoring younger ones through the simple act of sharing their own stories of growth and change. The story garden pulsed with gentle activity, drawing visitors who came not seeking dramatic healing, but drawn by invisible threads of connection. Thomas, now a skilled carpenter with hands that remembered River's early lessons about patience, maintained the garden's benches and pathways. Sometimes he would leave a small carved wooden bird where someone had shared a difficult memory, a silent testament to resilience and the enduring possibility of flight. Marcus brought his own evolution full circle during weekend visits, hosting workshops in the garden's barn where children and adults built small things that actually worked. Kites that flew, stools that didn't wobble, tiny bridges spanning basins of water. "Big is easy," he would say, threading string through a kite's spine while a child watched with fascination. "Steady is harder." By evening, participants carried home something useful and slightly miraculous, along with confidence that traveled like a new thread stitched into daily life. Elena's memory archive had become a living testament to the community's transformation, documenting not dramatic before and after comparisons, but the subtle accumulations that created new ground for healthier growth. Her work had evolved from preservation to active participation in creating a new kind of community history, one that honored both memory and possibility. River felt their own role shifting like seasons changing, from catalyst to witness to something even more transparent. They moved through the cafe and garden with Samuel's teaching alive in their presence. Window not portrait, bowl not banner. Their story threads had become so clear that they seemed to amplify others' capacity for insight, without claiming credit for the illumination. The revolution's most remarkable quality was its sustainability. Unlike programs requiring constant maintenance, the community's approach to narrative health had become self-perpetuating. People naturally created conditions where stories could flourish because they had experienced the profound satisfaction of being truly heard. The work continued, not because it was organized, but because it felt as essential as tending gardens or preparing nourishing meals. Mrs. Patterson now hosted tea gatherings for new mothers, her presence radiating the warmth of someone who had learned to trust her own nurturing capacity. Mr. Caldwell had transformed the post office bulletin board into a notice of noticings ID cards celebrating small acts of kindness observed in daily life. Lionel led evening poetry walks through the garden, his voice carrying the joy of someone who had rediscovered the spaces between words where meaning lived and breathed. The cafe menu barely changed, but its flavors grew more precise, as if the community's emotional palate had sharpened with attention. Comfort soup arrived exactly when someone finally spoke an unspoken truth. Courage bread appeared before apologies trembled at the edge of mouths. Clear mind tea materialized when tangled thoughts needed gentle untangling. On quiet evenings, River would stand beneath the willow arch, listening to the village settle into nighttime peace. The sounds carried different qualities now, more laughter from open windows, longer conversations on porches, the particular silence that comes when people feel safe to rest deeply. Even arguments, when they arose, carried tones of curiosity rather than conquest, voices seeking understanding rather than victory. Elena often joined River for these twilight observations, their partnership having deepened through years of shared purpose. "We're witnessing something unprecedented," she would say, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance. "Communities don't usually transform this organically, but this feels like natural evolution, as if people were always capable of this connection and just needed permission to remember. The work had succeeded not by conquering anything, but by remembering what had always been true. Every person carried stories worth treasuring. Communities flourished when they honored individual experience, and healing happened most powerfully through gentle reverence rather than force. River felt their own narrative preparing for its next chapter, understanding that what they had helped create would continue long after their direct involvement had transitioned into memory. As autumn painted the world in shades of letting go and holding on, River sensed the approach of their own season of release. The community no longer needed their active guidance. It had developed its own immune system for narrative health, its own capacity to recognize and respond to stories in need of care. In the space between one breath and the next, River felt profound gratitude for having been allowed to participate in this quiet revolution, this patient work of weaving the world back together, one conversation, one moment of genuine witness, one act of storytelling at a time. The village breathed with the rhythm of stories being born, nurtured, shared, and transformed, and somewhere in that gentle breathing, the revolution continued its work of helping all narratives remember their inherent wholeness and their place in the larger, ever-evolving tapestry of human connection. River's season of release arrived the way dusk arrives on certain summer evenings, so gradually that no one could say when day became night, only that the light had gentled and the edges of things had softened into something more beautiful than before. The quiet revolution breathed on its own now, and River felt the profound ease of knowing their careful tending had taken root in countless unseen ways, growing stronger not through their presence, but through their gradual, loving absence. The recognition came not as revelation, but as gentle acknowledgement, the way morning light reveals what was always there waiting to be seen. River woke in the cottage, where books still lined every wall like sleeping friends, their story threads now shimmering with the translucent quality they had witnessed in Samuel during his final season. Not fading, but becoming more transparent, more able to let light pass through without claiming credit for the illumination. Around them, the village hummed with the particular music of a community that had learned to tend its own narrative health. Mrs. Patterson arrived at the cafe each morning with herbs from her garden, her movements carrying the confidence of someone who understood her place in the larger story. Young Noor, now 8 and grown brave in the way of children who have learned that courage comes from connection, helped arrange flowers near the memory arbor with the careful attention of someone who knew that small acts of beauty mattered. The cafe continued its gentle work, now guided by Clara and a circle of storytenders who had learned to read the community's emotional weather with the same sensitivity River had once brought to individual healing. Mira, her notebook softened around the edges from years of recording what glowed with lasting warmth, had become its natural keeper. The menu evolved with the seasons, responding to collective needs with the organic intelligence of stories that had learned to listen to themselves. Samuel's empty frame had found its permanent home beneath the willow arch, creating a window for whatever needed to be blessed by being seen. People walked by and lifted it toward their faces, toward children and dogs, toward slices of sky that suddenly felt sacred when held within its weathered borders. River watched the way it changed the quality of silence around it, understanding that sometimes the shape of attention was enough. Elena found River there one morning, sitting in the dappled light, where Samuel had spent his final hours, their hands resting open like empty cups, waiting to be filled by whatever the dawn might offer. She settled beside them without words, understanding that some moments required presence rather than conversation, witness rather than interpretation. "I can feel it changing," River said softly, their voice carrying the particular clarity that comes when someone has learned to speak only essential truths. "The work here is complete, not because it's finished, but because it's learned to continue without us. The stories have remembered how to tend to themselves. The goodbye gatherings happened naturally, without formal announcement. People sensed the approaching transition and began arriving with the gifts that matter most. Stories shared, gratitude expressed, promises to continue the work in their own authentic ways. River received these offerings with transparent presence, understanding that their role was to witness rather than collect, to honor rather than possess. Marcus came home for a final weekend, carrying sawdust in his hair and a calmness that tasted like rain reaching roots. He had chosen work that fit his hands and mind at once, craft grounded in usefulness and wonder. The siblings shared a sandwich on Napping Hill, bread still warm, a slice of late tomato, rosemary rubbed between fingers to wake its memory. "You taught me to choose my own story," he said, not ceremonially, only true. "I just didn't realize you were learning it yourself until now." Elena's goodbye didn't fit the word goodbye. They stood together by the fountain, where water fell over copper leaves in the domestic music of rivering, their partnership having ripened into something beyond plans, shaped by years of shared noticing. There were no promises of forever, only the trust of cycles and return. They planted star jasmine near the frame, a note without signature that would write itself in scent each summer. On the morning of departure, River packed not belongings but intentions, pressed flowers from the garden's first season, Elena's documentation of community transformation, the worn book of lullabies that had nurtured their childhood. They left behind the vast library of stories, understanding that these tales belonged to the place and would continue their work of feeding hungry hearts long after. River had moved into their next chapter. The train carried them away as morning light painted the world in shades of possibility. Through the window, countryside rolled past like pages turning in an infinite book. River felt their own narrative expanding beyond individual identity into something larger and more mysterious, no longer just someone who could taste stories, but someone who had learned to become a clear channel through which the endless, intricate narratives of humanity could flow toward their own best expression. The village they left behind continued its quiet breathing, stories being born and nurtured and shared with the patient certainty of communities that had learned to trust their own capacity for connection. In coffee shops and gardens, in classrooms and kitchens, in the spaces between words where meaning lived and breathed, the gentle revolution continued its work of helping all stories remember their inherent wholeness. And somewhere, in a place that existed between heartbeats and beyond the reach of ordinary maps, River's transparent presence joined the endless dance of those who had learned to serve, not by doing, but by being. Not by healing others, but by creating conditions where all narratives could find their way home to themselves. The work continued, not because it was organized or directed, but because it had become as natural as breathing, as essential as love, as patient as stories learning to trust their own perfect timing. Somewhere, they're still out there, leaning into patches of sunlight, listening for the smallest stories, making soft places where every tired sentence can lie down and become a lullaby. Thanks for spending this time with us tonight. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.